Okay, welcome to Constructing a New Social Compact, a public forum on empowering the post-pandemic working class. I'm Lane Wyndham, the Associate Director of the Coleman-Flowers Initiative for Labor and the Working Poor at Georgetown, and we're thrilled that you're going to be here for this discussion today. Our session is called An Economy for People and Planet. What would it take? So first things first, our discussion is going to be interpreted in Spanish. And we have a slide that shows you how to access Spanish language interpretation using the globe at the bottom of your screen. And we are also going to put this information in Spanish in the chat. So this is how you access our discussion using Spanish. We're also recording. And we will have this session available on our website over the coming weeks. We are also live streaming our event on Facebook. Closed captioning is available through the button at the bottom of the screen. Today's event is part of a 4-day virtual convening featuring more than 25 sessions with 150 presenters from 5 continents. And we'll drop the full schedule for the events into the chat. And we hope that you can join us for a number of these events. I want to acknowledge our terrific organizing committee. We've had a group of more than 40 people who've been very active in putting together this week's events. And a special thank you to the Friedrich Ebert Foundation for sponsoring our convening. And thank you, of course, to all the panel members for joining us today. We will have a way for our audience to participate through questions today and through the chat. If you have a question for the panelists, please put it in the Q&A. And our chat is open, and we invite all of you to tell us who you are and where you're from in the chat. So please introduce yourself. Okay, so I am thrilled that Lauren Burke is going to be our moderator today. Lauren is the organizing director for the Labor Network for Sustainability. Lauren comes out of labor. She used to be a union organizer for Unite Here, and then became the Senior Atlantic Fellow for Social and Economic Equity when she studied at the London School of Economics when she did that fellowship. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Lauren. Lauren, take it away.
Thank you so much, Lane, and thank you to the Coleman-Flowers Institute for hosting this tremendous convening on the new social compact. This afternoon, I have the privilege to moderate this critical conversation exploring the question, an economy for people and the planet, what would it take? As Lane said, I'm Lauren Burke. I'm the organizing director of the Labor Network for Sustainability. Our mission at the Labor Network for Sustainability is to be a relentless force for urgent science-based climate action by building a powerful labor climate movement to secure an ecologically sustainable and economically just future where everyone can make a living on a living planet. Right now, we know that we have less than 10 years to dramatically shift our economy to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. And communities across the globe are already feeling the impacts: drought, wildfires, and increasing extreme weather events, to name a few. At the same time, we're facing a crisis of dramatic economic inequality and a long-needed reckoning with the structural racism that underlies our economic system. Over the past year, the pandemic has acted as a magnifying glass, bringing into focus these interlinked crises that we face. Today, our panelists will provide historical context for this moment, sharing their experiences and expertise from the labor movement and the environmental justice movement to help us all think about what it's going to take to move forward. My training as a union organizer was rooted in always valuing that people's lives at work, the good and the bad, are deeply connected to the rest of their lives and their communities. I have to admit that for a long time, I thought the environment and that climate change was somebody else's issue. But when I started paying attention, I began hearing the message coming from the environmental justice movement, that the environment is not a faraway thing, but rather it is the place where we live, work, and play. In that, I heard reflected the values I had learned in the labor movement. Right now, we are at a crossroads, and we must let our shared values guide us as we continue to build the strong movement fighting for the common good that we really need to rise to this tremendous challenges we face. And that's why I'm so excited today to have this conversation with our all-star panel. So first, I'd like to introduce all of our panelists, and then we'll jump into questions. So Sara Nelson has served as the International President of the Association of Flight Attendants, CWA, AFL-CIO, since 2014. She first became a union member in 1996 when she was hired as a flight attendant at United Airlines, and today she represents nearly 50,000 of aviation's first responders at 17 airlines. She believes flight attendants can play a pivotal role in strengthening labor movement with more public contact than almost any other job and access to every corner of the earth. Welcome, Sara.
Thank you very much.
And Catherine Coleman-Flowers is the founding director of the Center for Rural Enterprise and Environmental Justice. She is an environmental activist bringing attention to the largely invisible problem of inadequate waste and water sanitation infrastructure in rural communities in the United States. She is the author of Waste, One Woman's Fight Against America's Dirty Secret, and in 2020 was named a MacArthur Fellow. Welcome, Catherine.
Thank you.
And last but not least, Samir Sonti is an assistant professor at the CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies, and he has previously worked as a union organizer and researcher. He is currently writing a book on the history of U.S. labor and economic policy since the New Deal. Welcome, Samir.
Thanks, Lauren, and it's an honor to be here with these two monumental figures in our movement.
Great, great. So one last piece of housekeeping. We will be taking questions from the audience, but please use the Q&A function. I see that folks are already introducing themselves in the chat. That's great. So welcome to everybody. We've got a big topic today, so we're going to start with some pretty big questions. So first question goes to Sara. And my question for you, Sara, is why is climate change an issue for workers?
Well, thanks, Lauren. And first of all, I just want to say thank you so much to the Coleman-Flowers Institute or initiative and the work of Joe McCartan and Lane Wyndham to bring us all together. These are really important discussions if we're going to get this right. So as flight attendants, we can tell you how it affects our jobs. And many people who would like to just sort of gloss over the Green New Deal, or we heard a lot of things about when the Green New Deal was introduced, that this was going to be a job killer. And what I have to tell you is that as we have had increased climate disruptions, extreme weather events, we have seen an increase in clear air turbulence, for example. So this is a major hazard in our workplace where flight attendants and carts have been thrown around the cabin, sometimes on top of passengers or other people getting hurt, and it can actually be work-ending injuries. And so that is an issue, but we've also had aircraft that have to stay on the ground because the tarmac is too hot, or we've had infrastructure at airports be destroyed in these extreme events. So it's really important for us to understand that the solutions to climate change is not the job killer. Climate change itself is the job killer. And this is step number one, is defining the problem so that we can set our demands as workers and make a difference. This is why we are engaged. This is why the Association of Flight Attendants was the first union to endorse the Green New Deal. And I'm happy to be involved in this discussion because our jobs are going to continue to be affected. We're going to continue to be squeezed. And the great labor organizer, Mother Jones, told us over 100 years ago when she was fighting against child labor. She said, the capitalists say there is no need of labor organizing, except that they themselves are always organizing and showing their real beliefs. And the truth is that the corporate elite are looking for the next crisis to squeeze more and more control, more and more of our work. So if we are not having these discussions and setting the agenda and moving our world forward in a positive way for working people, we are going to find that we've been squeezed harder than ever before because we'll be willing to agree to anything just so that we can breathe. That's not where we want to get to. That's why we're engaged in this discussion, and it's affecting us right now in our workplace.
Thank you for that, Sarah. It's just so clear that, this is a conversation that's happening through struggle. And we have to really bring the perspective of working people to that struggle. So that's such a critical piece of this. Catherine, I'd like to turn to you and ask you a question. Why is environmental justice an issue of racial justice and economic justice?
Well, clearly, environmental justice is an issue of racial justice because a lot of the communities that are impacted historically have been communities of color. And if one look at the communities, I can just cite some examples because the way I tend to help people to understand, I usually take them and show them so they can see it firsthand. But I can just talk about what's happening right here in Montgomery, Alabama, which we recently found out that there are people in Montgomery, the capital of the state, and also the home of the modern day civil rights movement, but it was also the first capital of the Confederacy. And there are people living within the city limits of Montgomery where there's water and sewer available, and they're paying the water and sewer board for a water bill, but they're on septic systems and they're living in areas that are flood zones. And because of climate change, we're seeing more and more rain, and also the water tables are rising. And when these systems fail, the sewage is coming back into their homes. And this is creating a lot of problems. Along with that, in neighboring Lowndes County, which is where I'm originally from, and I do a lot of my work, we had the highest COVID infection and death rates per capita in the state of Alabama. And I'm sure a lot of it has to do with the fact that people are living in situations where they don't have sanitation. In addition to that, how it intersects, and I want to take a little further, how it intersects with labor, is that a lot of them are working in plants that are built around the area, that were recruited to this area, that are not paying a living wage, that force people to go to work and give them points if they don't show up. And after they get so many points, then they lose their jobs. So it's almost like a way of replacing slavery with another type of neo-slavery that's existing in these communities. And a lot of the families that have been impacted by COVID a family member got sick at work and brought it home to these homes that where people cannot socially isolate, and everybody got sick as a result. We've had here where there've been 2 and 3 people in the household to die from COVID, and that's devastating. So it is clearly, and the people that we see that are dying in this state are people of color. And there is no way around that. And I think a lot of it, if we look at all of this and all the problems that we're facing as it relates to environmental justice, goes all the way back to the same mentality that allowed us to bring people here and treat them like beasts of burden to work for nothing. And now trying to force people back to work in situations where they're not protected. And it creates and exacerbates these issues, especially people living in environmental justice communities. And a lot of this inequality exists primarily in communities of color, but we're also seeing it in other marginalized communities as well.
Thank you for that, Catherine. It's just so clear that the issues we're facing today are not new issues, right? There's nothing new about some of the crises we face. There's nothing new about some of the problems that people are facing that, climate change is making worse, but a lot of the problems that start aren't new. And, the truth is there's a long historical legacy that really underpins everything we're talking about today. And, we're also leaning on that historical legacy when we're thinking about the solutions, what we could be doing. And, in the last few years, we've started talking about the Green New Deal. Is an idea that's come up and gained a lot of popularity, and that obviously draws on the original New Deal. So I'm going to turn it over to our historian, Samir. Samir, could you talk with us a little bit about how is the experience of the New Deal still relevant today?
Sure. Yeah, Lauren, I mean, just before I get into it, thanks again, Lauren, for coordinating this, and KI. I mean, what an extraordinary set of events. And I feel really blessed to be here with 2, I mean, again, towering figures, Catherine and Sarah. I'm going to learn a lot from this conversation myself. It's an important question to ask. Like, why is this thing that happened a century ago at this point, or almost a century ago, still looming so large in our political imagination about what is to be done, to the point that progressive policymakers turn to it in naming the signature policy for the biggest issue confronting us today. And yeah, I think, the short answer is it's relevant because it was the last time, really, maybe with a little bit of an exception in the 60s, but the last big time that progressives succeeded at affecting real structural change in the political economy. And that's a little sad, right, that it was that long ago, and that's all we've got to draw on. But it is what it is. That's we don't choose our conditions. We make history under whatever we inherit. I think I would say, to kind of flesh that out a little bit, maybe two things that are particularly relevant and maybe useful for us. One is that the New Deal, we talk about it as if it's a thing, but it wasn't one thing. It was a lot of different things, a lot of different policies and programs with a million different acronyms that maybe some people remember from high school. And it was a coalition that was more often in conflict with one another internally than on the same page about things. And so I think that's an important kind of thing to recognize in when we talk about what this thing called the New Deal was. And so I would say maybe most useful for us today is, what were the most progressive elements within the New Deal coalition thinking and trying to do? What was their objective? And we can talk about how they fell short. But I think there were a couple of things that marked the vision from the progressive wing of the New Deal that we really could stand to benefit from studying today. One is empowering workers, right? They understood that the issue was one of power. And obviously unions were central to this, but in their minds, unions are valuable for raising wages and so on. But really, it was a question of power and ensuring that corporate power could be contended with by ordinary people, and organization and working class organization is a key to doing that. And another sort of related thing to that, in terms of what facilitates that kind of organizing, they had a vision of taking certain basic necessities out of the realm of the market, right? The things that we all depend upon to survive shouldn't be commodified. We should have some basic security. And as many organizers know, it's easier to organize from a position of security than from a position of desperation. So I think those, that vision is really useful in thinking about what is to be done today. I'd say just kind of the second thing, quickly in closing, is of course, most of this wasn't realized, right? It was maybe aspired towards, but in many ways fell short. In some ways because of issues of how the programs were designed, right? They were not always inclusive, in many cases very exclusive. Domestic and agricultural workers, for instance, who were disproportionately African American, were left out of the signature labor and employment policies. Housing policies were racialized through and through from the get-go. And also, I think it's important to note that the whole conceptualization was based on an idea of a male breadwinner, which sort of baked into the political economy of our society a very gendered division of labor. So there's these deficiencies that it had all along that we need to reckon with and be aware of as we think about what's next. But also in terms of thinking about, even for the people who were fully included, even for the people who were fully incorporated, the New Deal never realized its full vision, progressive vision of what Franklin Roosevelt may have sort of outlined in his economic bill of rights, of a right to a job, right to housing, and so on, right to health. And I think the reason there, and the reason it fell short in so many ways, is because of what it was up against, right? It was up against very powerful interests who fought it tooth and nail from the get-go, because it challenged the existing power structure. And that's something that we really need to be aware of right now. It's one thing that, we've got great ideas. We've got plenty of great ideas. The question is, can we build a force that's powerful enough to win what we all know we need? And I think that's really where the legacy of the New Deal is most relevant.
Thank you, Samir. I learned a lot in that, and I think, over the last year, we've really seen some of the deficiencies of the New Deal come to head, or like the long legacy of kind of the New Deal being torn apart, and like what that means as we face this pandemic. And I would say that the pandemic has created new problems, but has also magnified a lot of the problems we were facing before that. And so I'd like to ask you all a few questions, like thinking about how the pandemic has impacted the work that you do and how we're thinking about the work we do and how it's connected. So Catherine, I'd like to start with you. And I know your work has really focused on exposing the high level of parasitic infections resulting from the lack of sanitation infrastructure in the rural South. And when you first put that work out there, it was really shocking. I remember reading about it in the newspaper and just like, it just really was something that wasn't supposed to happen in America, was kind of the framing around it. And at this point, the pandemic has brought into focus the dramatic health inequalities in our country and globally as well. How has the pandemic connected with your ongoing fight for public health infrastructure?
Well, I think what the pandemic has done is expose why we need to address this. And it also has exposed that when we make something a priority, we can get there. I mean, a year ago, we didn't have a COVID vaccine. Now we have so much of it, we have surplus, we can send it to other places. That's because it became a priority. And likewise, we have to make it a priority to, first of all, identify those places throughout the United States that don't have access to sanitation. It's not just Lowndes County, Alabama. One of the things that we're fighting is, or people politicizing, is thinking they can go in and put in place the same failed infrastructure that has created this problem and say that that's a victory, and it's not a victory. But we've also found out from other people that have reached out and shared with us around the US that this is indeed a problem, not just with people not having any kind of sanitation, but failing sanitation that brings it back into their homes. One of the things that we found with our parasite study, that the people that had the highest parasitic infection were not the people that were straight piping. Straight piping means when you flush the toilet, it goes straight out on top of the ground. It was the people that were paying a wastewater fee or had paid for on-site septic systems that had failed, and they were coming back into their homes. They couldn't get away from it. It was coming back through a bathtub, a sink, or whatever, sometimes flooding the homes and sometimes even flooding the yards. And I've seen all too often when we went out in places and we saw where there were children's toys near where the effluent was on the ground. And so the impact of that, we really still don't know. And it is part of the inequality that continues to exist. And I think that it's all tied to all the things that we're discussing today. There's a historical precedence for this. I mean, we look at racial covenants, where people could live. We can look at the Fair Housing Act. It was well-intentioned, but in some cases, a lot of these well-intentioned programs, as Samir had said, don't really materialize. Or in a lot of cases, the racism is so structural that we got to unpack those structures so that we can make sure that these programs work. And that's part of what we're going to have to look at this time as we try to dismantle what has caused these health disparities in communities across the country. We're going to have to dismantle these structures, because even if we have the best of times, the best of policy in place, without dismantling those structures, by the time it gets to the state, we're right back where we were before. And I believe that during the pandemic, it's given us a chance to pause. My Indigenous brothers and sisters actually calls this the time of the pause. But I think it's given us the time to pause and also to work on policy. I think I've done more policy work in the past year than I've done any other time. But we also understand that along with that policy work, we got to do that work on the ground. It's essential that work is done in the states and on the local levels as well.
That makes a lot of sense. And I'm feeling the more policy thing recently as well. So that might be a symptom across the board. But I think, kind of pointing that the pandemic has really shown light on the structures and like how structures can change. And one of those things that's changed is how people are working, right? Not, like in a lot of different ways. Who's considered an essential worker has changed. How people work, people working from home. The pandemic's changed how many people work and the very way we relate to work. And so, Samir, I know you've done some research around this. How has the pandemic accelerated changes in labor participation, and what are the implications for that as we move forward?
Yeah, it's I mean, it's obviously a lot, and it's obviously still sort of to be determined, right? How this shakes out over the long term. In part, I mean, things seem to be heading in a good direction here, but we're seeing what's happening in India, and we know how this thing can reverberate globally, and so we don't know, right, what the future of the pandemic's going to be. And how things are going to recover is going to depend a lot and on exactly what Catherine was talking about purposeful policy, right? I mean, that's going to play a major role in determining this. So we heard from the president last night. We'll see how much of that ends up becoming law. But I mean, generally, I think we can draw a few impressions at this point. One that is increasing, finally, I think being reported on increasingly, is the disproportionate effect this has had on working class women in particular. 2 million women have fallen out of the workforce over the last year. That's a historically significant rupture with recent trends, and obviously that bears most acutely on lower wage workers who are involved in human to human service provision. And I mean, Sara, for instance, we could talk a lot more about this, but this is clear in certain industries. I mean, Lauren, both you and I have had experience with Unite here, and Sara's as well versed on the travel industry as anyone. The travel and tourism industry has been just devastated, as we all know, and that industry is powered largely by women of color, immigrant women. And so what that's going to look like how it's going to recover, to what extent it's going to recover, is very much an open question. What I think we can say for sure is market forces alone are not going to ensure that it recovers in an equitable way, right? What we're going to need in order to guarantee that the workers who have done that, provided those very valuable services for a long time in tourism and hospitality, in retail, in a variety of service, in human interacting areas and sectors, is going to depend on public policy, right? Are we going to actually invest in this? And I think I would just say, kind of, maybe I'll wrap up here, but just taking the broader historical sort of picture, one thing that this has really thrown into relief, I think, what it's upended is some assumptions we've had about the nature of service work. For the last several decades, it's kind of not news that manufacturing and industrial production and industrial employment has been declining. That's been wound up with a general downward trend in investment, right? Capitalist investment has been slowing in the U.S. and across the advanced capitalist world for decades now. And the one area of employment which has been growing has been service work. And service work is a big category, right? I mean, like, everyone from lawyers to domestic workers are considered service employees, but the biggest share of service employment is largely low wage women. And I think one thing that, at least from an organizing perspective, we've all hoped would be sort of a potential source of power is that those jobs can't go away, right? That they can't be shipped away. They can't be automated very easily, and that was going to potentially be a source of durable power. I think this raises questions about that assumption, and raises questions about how we think about how jobs are created and whether we can count on private investment to sustainably create jobs, or whether we need more sustained public support for employment creation.
Thank you, Samir. I think that's so critical, and I think you raised the fact that many workers were very seriously impacted by the pandemic. And I know AFA was one of the airlines was one of the industries very hard hit, and the members of AFA very hard impacted. But I also know that Sara led a very critical fight to make sure that there was relief for the most impacted workers. And so, Sara, I want to turn to you to share a little bit about that experience, but I'm curious, what have we learned from the work to fight for pandemic relief that we should take forward as we tackle the climate crisis?
Well, thanks. Gosh, I love my colleagues on this panel. This is so great. Samir talked about earlier corporate power and contending with corporate power. And what we heard last night from the president was not only all these policy initiatives, but also fundamental to his message has been that we have to encourage workers joining unions. We have to make it easier for workers to join unions. And the fact of the matter is that, yes, the people that I represent were very much caught in the crosshairs of this crisis. We knew from the crisis after 9/11 and all the bankruptcies that followed, what happens if you don't take that moment, when you have leverage and strike with your demands, that it can get out of your hands and the corporate elite can squeeze you more than ever before. So what we did was we put forward a policy initiative that was about workers first. And we said that any government relief needed to go to keeping workers in our jobs. This was important in this moment because we had to have immediate solutions. So we didn't want to have 97% of the airline industry suddenly on the unemployment line. That's what we saw happen overnight, was 97% of the demand dropped. We likely would have seen bankruptcies and airlines go out of business and the entire industry collapse. That would have had a reverberating effect across our economy. And also the airline industry provides critical infrastructure to be able to address and attack the virus as well, moving critical ventilators and getting people the mail and their prescription drugs at home and moving critical personnel to places where they can address these issues. When those furloughs were threatened, actually, it was my members who were at the tip of the spear because the big aircraft were put on the ground first. And so while you might have 2 pilots flying that plane, you may have 13 flight attendants staffing the plane. And so who are flight attendants? Well, we're 80% women. Because of the work of our union, more and more the airlines have been hiring in a more diverse fashion. So those were the more junior flight attendants. So women and people of color were the ones who were going to be the most affected. And that's what we saw. Of course, it was a shared experience across the pandemic. But what we put forward was this workers first package that we were able to achieve. And I want to be really clear about how we were able to achieve this. We're 80% unionized in the airline industry. And so what Chairman DeFazio, the chairman of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, said to the corporations when they were looking for money from the government to decide how they were going to use that to save the airlines, not the people, but save the airlines. He said, you have to go through labor. I'm not talking to you until you talk to them. And so we had this moment where we had incredible leverage and we demanded of the airlines that they come to our plan, that we were not going to be a sideshow, we were going to be the main event, that this relief could only go for pay and benefits of workers. We had to keep everyone in their jobs. There could be no diminishment to the hourly rate of pay. So we were setting the tone that this pandemic and this crisis was not going to be put on the backs of workers, that we were not going to take concessions and we were not going to fall into a world of austerity where we were asked to just give a little bit. We've already done that. We've been there and we didn't want to go back. But the other thing that we did was we said, you have to cap your executive compensation, ban stock buybacks and dividends. The things they would not agree to were union neutrality. So they would agree to these things that were already in place and would agree even to a cap on their own pay, but they would not agree to staying out of union organizing so that we could gain more power. So I want to make that very clear. But this worked. This kept us in our jobs, connected to our healthcare. As long as we have employer-based healthcare, that was critically important. And it made sure that we were not having the government be the HR solution for people who no longer had jobs, so that those payroll taxes that we pay also continued through that system. We continue to support our local governments and sanitation and mass transportation and education. And we continue to pay into our Social Security system and into Medicare and into the safety nets that we need for the rest of our lives. So it was a really good plan that was designed by workers. We brought capital to the fight. We went in a unified fashion to Congress, and even under a Trump and McConnell regime, we were able to achieve that. Now, what we achieved with Chairman DeFazio in the House was also requirements for the airlines to address climate, to get to carbon neutral by 2050. That was in the House bill. And because this was hijacked in the political process and other people said, didn't understand necessarily the importance of that in this moment, the airlines did not have to ultimately agree to that in the end, but they had agreed to it in the House. So I think it's really important that we understand that labor organizing is a huge part of this. You can't count anyone out, because in the workplaces, we can have these discussions about the problems. We can define the problems, and then we can determine what the demands are. And the more that we have working people everywhere understand what our demands are about how we're going to create a green economy, the more that people will support that and the politics will move. So if we start in the workplace, the politics will move to a place where we can actually achieve the things that we're talking about today. And I'll stop there for now, but I just want to put a fine point on this, that this is about power. And the corporate elite have money and they have control. But if we really have the public and the working people of this country understand what our demands are, why it's important that we achieve these things, there is no reason that we cannot move the politics. And in fact, we have already done that. We heard from Lindsey Graham last week, recognizing that climate is something that we have to take on. This is the first time we've ever heard that from him. And that has been because of a lot of the work that we're talking about that has been going on during this time. So our shared experience coming out of this pandemic and the successes that we had during this time are going to lead to what we can do in addressing this climate crisis in a way that is going to rebuild our economy with equity and with labor power and with working people really controlling what we want our world to look like.
Thank you, Sarah, for that. And, I think we are at a moment with a lot of possibility right now. We are facing a moment where, maybe 6 months ago, what's in front of us, we didn't necessarily think was possible. And so that's exciting. And I'd like to get into that a little bit more with everybody. Just before we jump into that, I do want to let folks know that we will have a question and answer period. And so please start putting any questions you have for the panelists into the Q&A. That way we can tee those up for our panelists. So I know some questions are bubbling up. I think I've seen some in the chat, but if you could please put them in the Q&A, we would greatly appreciate that. So I know President Biden had a pretty critical speech last night where I think we're at 100 days or tomorrow is 100 days. I'm not very good at math, but we're pretty much there. He just released the American Jobs Plan in the last month. And Samir, I know you've conducted an analysis of the American Jobs Plan. So I wanted to kind of start this piece of our conversation, just turning it over to you. What have you found in your analysis of the American Jobs Plan?
Yeah, I think, well, I'll say, I mean, and we just have to all, tip our hats to the extraordinary efforts that the flight attendants and others have done to ensure that these, that the CARES Act and then the rescue plan were as sort of ambitious as they were. I don't think that would have happened even under a Democratic Congress were it not for the sustained pressure from the movement. And I think that pressure and the power that, I mean, it's notable hearing Catherine, Lauren, and Sarah all say that we've been spending more time doing policy work, because it's clear that our movement is shaping policy in a much more profound way than I mean, certainly at any point in my lifetime. I mean, that's for sure. And so I would say, with the infrastructure plan generally, the president outlined the sort of the family plan, or sort of the social infrastructure piece last night, following up on maybe the physical infrastructure and the climate proposal a few weeks ago. I think it's a great start. I think it's very, very impressive compared to where we've been. And I would also say it doesn't go far enough, right? And that we need to think of it as an opportunity to move our agenda forward, and to create a platform from which we can continue to organize in the years to come. So, I mean, the key thing that I'll say about this, and I think that is what distinguishes this economic program from the last generation of economic policy, is the emphasis, sort of building on what I was saying a moment ago, on public investment. There is a recognition from the administration that's quite clear, that they're not shying away from, that the economy has been in stagnation for a long time. certainly been, the recovery from 2008 was never particularly strong, as we all know. But even prior to that, going back decades, there's been a general sluggishness that's manifested above all in employment insecurity for working people and stagnant wages. And this is a historical problem. Investment from the capitalist class has been slowing for a long time. Capitalists invest when they see profits. And for various reasons, they have not seen tremendous profits to be made in the US. And what we know is that the areas in which we need the most investment going forward, which is caring for people, like caring for one another, caring for the elderly, caring for children, caring for people with disabilities and people who are ill, and caring for the environment, right? Those are the two areas that we need the most investment. And those are not areas that are particularly profitable to invest in. So we shouldn't expect private interests to take these crises on their own. The only way we're going to create the kinds of programs and jobs we need to address these twin crises is through public investment, and that, I will say, in a way that breaks with economic policy paradigms for the last generation, the Biden administration is clearly committed to doing. Now, the question, right, and I think this is why we need to be aware of what's going on and indeed celebrate what's going on, but be sober about it as well, is it up to the challenge of really addressing these crises over the long term? They talk about this as a one-time investment program, a once-in-a-generation investment program that they believe will kind of initiate a new plane of economic growth and private investment in the years and decades to come. I think that we need to always be fighting for greater and greater expansion of the public good. And this is a great start. This gives us like some wind at our backs to do that. But by no means can we accept this as the sort of definitive answer to the crises that the coming generations face.
It's a very clear point, and it's clear we can't just put our feet up and declare victory at this moment, that there's still very much work to do. And I actually wanted to turn to Catherine, because I know you're deep into some of this work right now. Congratulations on your recent nomination to the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. I know you've been putting in some long hours with that council recently. So I wanted to ask you, what is the work you're doing through that council, and what do you think it's possible for the advisory council to achieve?
Well, the advisory council is composed of environmental justice activists from throughout the United States, including Puerto Rico. And I think that what we're doing is paving a road that has never been there before. I've never known, and I don't think that there's anything in our history where a president or an executive branch of government has put together such an illustrious team of people to bring to the executive branch of government grassroots testimony and input in developing policy in terms of how to bring about the change. And that is what I see coming out of the WEJAC. It's a beginning, it's a start, and it's something that has never really been done before. Yesterday, we had our second public meeting, and we had a lot of comments, and it was just interesting, the array of people that were listening and gave comments who are very concerned about the environment. Not just the traditional EJ communities that we hear about, but there were people calling in that gave comments. For an example, one person said he was a former Tea Partier in Pennsylvania and was talking about fracking and the impact that it's having on his water. There were people that were calling from Miami, for an example, that talked about what is happening there with gentrification, this climate gentrification, where they're being forced to move. People are moving from the beach because now the beach is becoming a victim to climate change because of sea level rise. And the high ground that only was available to people of color at one point because they weren't allowed to live or couldn't buy on the beach is now coveted because it's not as much under threat as those areas that are beachfront property now. So there were people from across the country that were paying attention and involved, even people from from West Memphis who were fighting the Byhalia pipeline, which is, for those that don't know, it's a pipeline that they're building in this area that's going through a traditional freedman's town where Black people settled after slavery. And it also threatens the water source for over 1 million people in that area because it would go through an aquifer that provides water, and one leak could devastate that for everybody. So I think with the WEJAC, we're getting the opportunity to bring this front and center to people in the executive branch to see these kinds of concerns that never get addressed, because the only people that have that type of access tend to be the corporate elite that we've been talking about in this conversation. But the WEJAC provides another avenue for us to have that access. And I would encourage everyone to go to the website, register for the public meetings, and have input, because out of that, there will be 3 things that I have to touch upon quickly. One, it was laid out in the executive order on environmental justice, and that with the American Jobs Plan and the benefits that are, especially as part of this infrastructure plan, that at least 40% of the benefits have to go to those overburdened and marginalized communities. And that's important. That's never happened before. And then the second part of that is that we also have to, there's an equity tool that will measure, what that looks like. And I'm hoping that this equity tool that we develop or will be a prototype for organizations across the board who also need to measure what they're doing and how is impacting equity across the board. So we're looking at in a different way being able to address environmental justice. And the third task is to rewrite the executive order on environmental justice. So it's still in progress, it's new. I am lucky to serve with some of the best grassroots activists in the country as it relates to environmental justice. But this is also an opportunity for the public to be engaged and involved and to submit public comment as well.
I think that just highlights how critical it is that everybody's experience is really taken into account as we think about the solutions and what it's going to take to move forward. And it's just exciting to hear that process is creating a space, a forum to have that discussion and for people to bring their experiences from all over the country to government to talk about what it's going to take, what solutions we're really looking for. So that's really exciting. And I'm really excited, Catherine, that you're at that table and I'm sure being a force there as well.
I wanted to also add to that, as part of that is also a just transition. That's one of the things that we're discussing as well, because one of the things that was brought up during our public meeting yesterday are people that are in, for an example, coal country. We have to be conscious and make sure that they have access to the good union paying jobs that's going to come out of this infrastructure plan as we shift our economy toward clean energy. And that's very, very important that we have that. And that's the intersection between what we've been talking about this morning in terms of the role that labor is going to play in this, because we're not going to be able to get anywhere without having people that are workers engaged and involved in this process.
Mm-hmm.
That's absolutely true. And I think on that, Catherine, I'm actually going to jump to one of the questions from the audience because there is a question there for Sara. And I think I'm going to take this a little more broadly. The question's from Will Jones asking about, if there's a shift away from air travel, what does that mean for workers in the airline industry? But it gets to this broader question about a just transition for workers and what it's going to take to have a just transition for workers. And so I wanted to ask you that question, Sara, of what would it take to have a just transition for workers in your industry? And also, I know, you are talking with a lot of other labor leaders, a lot of other workers. So in your discussions as well, like what would it take?
Yeah, so I really appreciate that question for a lot of reasons, and not just for the practicality of it, like what is this going to take, but recognizing that oftentimes, in every time, the corporate elite has won by dividing us against ourselves. Okay, so traditionally they have used racism, they have used sexism, they have used any kind of difference between workers to try to pit us against each other. I think about the pandemic during this time, and I think about our union that was formed by women, and we fought for men to have the same rights on the job as women, but we really had to fight to gain that recognition. And I think during this pandemic, we saw that there's essential work everywhere. We have been led to believe that different jobs are only worth so much because they're low skilled. The fact of the matter is that the wages are the issue, and everyone deserves a fair living wage for the work that they're doing. So I just came from the miners' strike in Alabama. And they are taking on a company that went into bankruptcy, that ripped up their contract, ripped up their pay, their pensions. Many of them have only had 4 days off in the last year. So it's all that productivity again going to the corporate elite. And miners have never seen a just transition. So when you start trying to talk with people and get between them and their jobs and start there, the conversation is dead before you start, because people are, for a couple reasons. First and foremost, people have to take care of themselves and their families. And if you're telling them that the solution means that they might not be able to do that, you're done. It's over. Secondly, people really identify with the work that they do. They take pride in that. So there has to be a respect there. There has to be a recognition there that we have to get into the communities and see what the communities need. I think it's really important for us to recognize that the mine workers, the steel workers, were some of the first people in this country to fight on environmental justice issues, because their companies were polluting the water that their children were drinking, or polluting the air that their children were breathing. And they fought back against that, and they fought for safety regulations. These are our allies. They are not opposed to us, but they have been left to believe that no one cares about them because people throw away comments like, well, get over it, coal's dead, move on, and learn to code. And all they've ever seen is a few hours of training, and then their community is decimated. And what happens when their communities get decimated? The 5 jobs that depend on those coal jobs are also decimated. So you have an entire community that is angry, that doesn't believe that public policy or politicians are looking out for them. And they are susceptible to people who are going to say, we're going to take care of you, and, screw the elite and screw the policymakers and the progressives who don't know what you deal with. That's what's in danger here. If we don't understand that we've got to take on the reality of people's jobs, meet them where they are, have those conversations in that place, join those fights, secure the pensions that are at risk because bankruptcies have occurred and all of these things have happened. And so it's really important to talk about how do you transition that work in a way that makes sense. So talk about what work can be done. What is the new work going to look like? What do you need in your community that is missing? Are there schools to be built? All of these conversations have to happen in the community, but they're not going to happen. And the kind of power that we need to generate the kind of jobs and new community that we need are not going to happen unless workers are able to actually take on these corporations, because otherwise the corporations have all the money. We know that they control our politics in many ways because corporations are people too in our democracy at this time. And they get into the rooms. What Catherine was talking about and is different with this administration that I really appreciate, and I appreciate the tone that has been set by the president and the reverberation that is happening with his chief of staff, Ron Klain, in inviting all these different voices into the White House. The task force that was set up to talk about building union power and building unions at a cabinet level, that is not just signaling the importance that the president is giving to unions and to his statement that he wants to be the most union-friendly guy that there is. He recognizes that we have had decades of moving away what labor unions are really about, and how labor unions actually hold capital responsible and provide a check that these politicians cannot provide on their own. They're going to continue to be beholden to corporate money. If we don't have a check at the ground level in those corporations with the workers who hold that corporate elite accountable. So putting together this task force and making his cabinet have to go through this process where they are prioritizing unions is putting people through an exercise, even people who have come out of the consultant world and come out of the investment banker world, through a process that they have never had to live with and do not understand. And this is critically important. So some of the work that we did on policy in the Unity Task Force to put forward policy that we're talking about now, some of the most important policy is on increasing and improving labor rights, because we're not going to have any of this sustained or change our politics to get to a place where we can actually have a just transition. What does a just transition look like? A just transition looks like transitioning people with continued pay at the rate of pay. Let's be very clear. Coal jobs can be very good paying coal jobs, very good paying jobs. So don't say, you're going to go do some other work that's going to be at half the value. You have to recognize, you have to maintain that lifestyle and that amount of pay and decide who is close to retirement. And so that you can just continue that pay and continue the security of their retirement and healthcare. And who can we talk about retraining into new jobs, but jobs that meet that same pay and those same standards. It's very important. And in the meantime, stand next to the workers who are fighting right now against these corporations. So this strike in Alabama against Warrior Met, we got to get behind those workers and stand with the United Mine Workers of America. And I want to recognize that the United Mine Workers, for the first time, have engaged in this conversation and have started to talk about what kind of demands they would put forward as a just transition that they have never seen happen before. But the fact that they're engaging in that has happened because climate justice, people have started to understand that we're never going to get there if we believe that a green economy is at odds with the labor movement. We have to do this together. We have to break through the divide and conquer that the corporate elite have used forever to keep us down and keep our demands from making progress. So it's going to take new technology, certainly in the aviation industry. We can do that. We can create greener technology, but where those jobs are shifting, in some cases to high-speed rail, then we need to make sure that we are transitioning people in a way where they are not losing their lifestyle, losing their ability to care for their families, and able to pick a job where they feel pride in doing that work.
Thank you, Sara, not only for those comments, but I know all the hard work you've done to move the needle and make this conversation a different conversation in the labor movement. I want to thank you as somebody in this movement for all the hard work that you're doing on that as well. And it's just clear, across the board, there are a lot of things that we can start to think about in different sorts of ways, right? Like we can feel the thinking shifting, what's possible shifting. And this is, I'm turning to a question from the audience, and I'm hoping, Samir, I can ask you this one. Linda asked, recent administration touting the economic growth rate has been touting the economic growth rate in the last quarter. How can we talk about the healthy economy not based on the gross national product or GNP, right? How can we talk about a healthy economy, a healthy society without necessarily tying it to growth?
Yeah, I think this is like the essential, or one of the essential questions of the 21st century, right? How do we measure success? Moving beyond sort of the models and frameworks of the 20th century when economic growth, unbridled economic growth was the sole metric. As we know, economic growth is a GDP growth, let's say, is an aggregate figure. It does not tell us anything about how that is affecting individuals or how it's distributed, right? How that growth is distributed, who's accruing the lion's share of that. It doesn't tell us any of that. Per capita growth doesn't do that either. And so I think, the way that we measure a decency and equity in a society is by how the proceeds are going around. Employment is one way to do that. Wage growth is one way to do that. And I think the social wage is one way to do that, to think about the economy and think about compensation and wages, not just in an individualized sense, not just in what you and I earn in our paychecks, but what what is provided to all of us as a guaranteed social wage. That's the real measure of a decent society. And by social wage, I mean, again, things like the basic necessities of life being taken out of the marketplace. So we are not dependent for our survival, right? I mean, whether we're going to starve or be flung from our homes based on fluctuations in a private marketplace that are volatile, irrational, and often impossible to control. How do we ensure that everyone has basic security for the things that they need to survive outside of that? That is the measure of economic health. And I think that's the one we're going to have to try to fight for in, the coming century, really. But as we know, and as Sara and Catherine have been pointing out, I mean, it's one, we can say that, right? But winning it, we know what needs to be done. We know exactly what needs to be done. How do we win it? Involves, building a force that can contend with the powerful interests that profit off of the way things are right now, not just profit off of the healthcare industry itself, for instance, but profit off our dependence on employers for health insurance, yes. Right? Their ability, it's not just that insurance companies make a lot of money, it's that all employers, capital as a whole, profits off our subordination to them because of our dependence on employer-based healthcare. And expanding the social wage not only takes a lot of things out of the realm of profiteering, which should never be a profit-seeking enterprise like health care and so on, but it also empowers us. It ends this sort of grotesque subordination we have to private capital for a job so that we can have access to things that we all need.
Yeah, it's clear that we need more of what we're starting to talk about more, a stronger social infrastructure to really support people's basic needs, and even a little bit more than basic needs, right? Like that's okay too. And I wanted to turn this to Catherine, because your work has been so much, I was, as Samir was talking, I was thinking about this idea of social infrastructure, and it returned me to your work, Catherine, that's so much about physical infrastructure and how much that's connected to social infrastructure and people's abilities to live successful lives. And so for the communities that you work with, Catherine, what would it take to have a just transition for those communities?
I think the first thing we have to do is acknowledge that the current system of labor is based upon slavery. Mm-hmm. I think that it has been a continuation. They found different ways for it to evolve, and where the workers get nothing for their labor, and it keeps them dependent. It's almost like, to me, it's like a variation of the sharecropper system. But now instead of sharecropping, they're allowing multinational corporations to come here and exploit the labor, and for the few to benefit, but a lot of the other people are suffering. So what I would like to see is a shift in that economic paradigm, where it's, first of all, dismantling it, where it's not based on a system that helped America to grow, which was slavery, and that was based on free labor, to now they want nearly free labor. So we have to shift that. And I think it will also involve making up for the gaps that have been created in families generationally, because their labor was taken from them without them benefiting from it. And ultimately dismantling a lot of the structures that have supported, and some of them have been supported by the structures that have supported this unequal paradigm. And some of them have been unintentionally enabled by people that were well-intentioned, because they don't understand the history. That's why it's so important for Samir to be here to talk about that, because a lot of this is grounded in history, and people have changed the names of it and dressed it up to make it look like it was something else. But it was all about extracting free labor. And one of the stories that I like to share that a lot of people are aware of who followed my work, is about Pamela Rush, who lived in a single-wide mobile home. That's not uncommon in places like Lowndes County. But the structure is set up in such a way that the homes that when I buy my home appreciates in value. But mobile homes are like cars. When you take them off the lot, they depreciate in value. And then you add predatory lending, and all of the things that are allowed to happen to people who cannot fight for themselves. And they're trapped in these systems. And at the end of the day, COVID came along, magnified, amplified those problems, and killed a lot of people who are now in a position where they've lost breadwinners, or they've lost mothers, and they've lost fathers. And in some cases, people aren't even in a position where they can pay for funerals. That is how bad it is here. And I believe that we have to have not just a conversation, but we have to start dismantling a lot of this. And some of it comes with, I mean, in this state, for an example, to even, there was a discussion to change the name of Jeff Davis Street to name it in honor of Fred Gray, who was the attorney that represented Rosa Parks when she refused to give up her seat. It's going to cost $25,000, there's a $25,000 fine to remove any Confederate monument here in the state of Alabama. So those are the kinds of, I mean, there's more emphasis on replacing Confederate monuments than it is on dismantling the policies that enable the inequalities that impact the productivity of this state and why young people are leaving. So we have to have a serious discussion about dismantling these things. And at the same time, we got to work on dismantling. And part of that, I think, is supporting voting rights for people throughout the South, because voter suppression here is about making sure that these monuments to the Confederacy remain in place. And a lot of it has to do, as we know, I mean, there are people that tell you that the war was not fought over slavery. It was. So because they wanted to have free labor. And now it doesn't just extend to Black people and people of color, it extends to all of us. And that's why we have to be very careful about that, and fighting for voting rights for all of us, and fighting voter suppression, I think, is a step in the right direction of bringing down the system that has created these inequities.
Thank you, Catherine. I think we have to really fight for our democracy and make sure that we have a voice in every, from the workplace, as Sarah's been talking about, but to the ballot box and in our communities. That's going to be a key piece to affect the change that we really need to see across the board. We're almost out of time, but I want to ask the same question to all of you to conclude. So my question to all of you, and I'd like to start with you, Sara, is what do we need in a new social compact to ensure an economy for people and the planet? That's what we're here to talk about today. So Sara, what's it going to take?
So listen, I think that we have an opportunity to follow the policy ideas that are in the Green New Deal. And it's funny because a lot of people ask me, well, why did AFA sign on as an endorser of the Green New Deal? And I said, well, we read it. And it talks about a lot of the things that Samir is talking about, that there are basic human needs that should not be commoditized. And so healthcare has to be a human right, a job guarantee, okay? So that we don't have corporations who can just hold that labor, hold that, as Catherine was talking about, the baseline of the slave system over people's heads. We also really, the only way that we are going to do this, I have to go back to this because everyone else can talk about the policies here that we have to have, but the only way that we're going to achieve them is if we break down the divides and we get into these communities and we talk with each other. I referenced the mine workers who are on strike right now. They are mining metallurgical coal, which is the basis for making steel, which we need in order to make solar panels. I saw Christina Marquez from IBEW Local 569 in San Diego is on this call right now. And there are ideas within the labor movement and people who have skills right now that we're not hearing from and not respecting and not bringing to this conversation and engaging in this way. Catherine is talking about how that has changed, how that is improving. But the thing that we need to take away from this, as we set our demands for the kind of world that we want to build, is the only way we get there is to understand that every single person brings value to this conversation, and you can't count people out. And in the politics, you can't count out red states or red counties. We have to hold everyone accountable, and we hold people accountable by getting in and having conversations with the people who live in those communities, identifying the problems in their communities and working with them to set the demands, and then having their backs to make those changes. And that is how really we're going to build the political will to get in place all of the policy ideas that are outlined in the Green New Deal. So I can't say that enough, that we can't sort of tell people what to think here. We have to stop saying people vote against themselves, because the truth of the matter is that people vote when they hear something that means something to them. And we've gotten to a place where the conversation has moved so much into the corporate realm, and labor and people are the sideshow. And we're really the main event. So building an economy that is about the people in this country and around the world, and is about building an economy where everyone gets to thrive and there's actual equity in that, those are the demands that we have to have when we build this new green economy, and treating it that way and moving ahead that way and respecting every voice is how we're going to get there.
Thank you, Sara, for those marching orders. I appreciate it. Now I'm going to, Samir, turn the question to you. What do you think we need for a social compact to ensure an economy for people and the planet?
Well, I mean, of course, agree entirely with everything Sara just, so movingly said, and everything that Catherine was talking about the, relationship between, what we call free labor and unfree labor, and the origins of our current system, and the relationship between what we have and the past. I would say it's hard to follow, Sara. That's it's really really moving to hear that. I would simply say, I guess, what we've been outlining, what Catherine's talking about in terms of the just transition, what Sara's talking about in terms of the just transition, in terms of the climate side of this, and in terms of sort of the social and the caring side of this. These are complex problems that are solvable, but require coordination, right? We need to be purposefully thinking about how to do this, and that they're not going to be magically resolved through the market responding to our needs, right? It's going to require planning, very purposeful planning, in order to ensure that people who are displaced by the disruptions that are already occurring are cared for, are given alternative opportunities, and in ways that are empowering and not alienating. And that means that we need to say very boldly and emphatically that the economy is not outside of all of us. It is not some sort of it's not determined by natural law. The economy is made by all of us. It's ours, and we ought to democratically control it, and make it what we want it to be. And that is a break from where we've been in recent decades. It's a break with how we understand capitalism, and really nothing short of that is gonna enable us to respond to what's to be done. And the only way we do that, as both of my co-panelists have said very eloquently, more eloquently than I could, is through our collective power.
Thank you, Samir, and you have brought a lot of eloquence to this conversation, and a lot of context that has really rooted this. So thank you for bringing that to this conversation. So Catherine, I'll turn it to you to have the last word. Catherine, what do you think we need in a new social compact to ensure an economy for people and the planet?
I think we have to have everyone at the table. I think Sara was so right. And I live in a red state, and one of the things that I'm often asked about is how do I work with some of the people in this area. I've had to. So I've learned the skills necessary to survive and have conversations, and sometimes to have the hard conversations. And I've been surprised at sometimes the outcome of those conversations, and how we become allies, and we may not agree on everything. And we may not, but that happens in all relationships. We don't agree on everything. But by looking at each other as humans and starting from there, I think that we can move the needle forward. And in order to, and we have to understand that there is one planet and this is it. And we're going to have to do what's necessary so that not only we can live, but the future generations. And I do this work because I have a 5-year-old grandson, and I'm very concerned about his future. And we have to change. We have to change because we cannot keep extracting, and killing people and killing the planet. Because at the end of the day, it would mean that my grandson and the 7 generations to come will have nothing to look forward to. So it is important and emphatic that we have these kinds of conversations, but that we also work together and collaborate to find those solutions, because I think they're possible and we can change this unequal system that exists.
Thank you, Catherine, for that. I hear our marching orders that we need to go out and have the difficult conversations. We need to organize, we need to listen to each other, and we need to fight. So I just want to thank this tremendous panel for bringing your all to this conversation today. I know I really learned a lot. I think everybody who's joined us has really enjoyed this conversation, and it's really made us think a lot about what we can do, what we are doing, and what's possible in the future. So thank you, Sara Nelson. Thank you, Catherine Coleman-Flowers. Thank you, Samir Sonti, for being a part of this. Also, thank you to the Coleman-Flowers Initiative for hosting this great series of conversations.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks.
Everyone.